Hello everyone, we're just about to get started. I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Eva, and we are 2 of 12 members of the MA Curating cohort who curated an exhibition recently at the Courtauld Gallery called Good Morning Midnight, which is open until July 7th. If you haven't gotten to see it yet, it'd be great if you guys could go at some point. This is the second and final museum debate that we've organized for our course, and we really wanted to tie this specific museum debate to our exhibition. Performance is one of the defining themes of our exhibition, which considers works from the Courtauld's Post-Impressionist collection and contemporary artworks from the David and Indrė Roberts collection, which is managed by the Roberts Institute of Art.
We worked closely with curator at the Roberts Institute, Ned O'Connell, who we're delighted to have with us this evening, alongside Prem Sahib to discuss their recent project, and Prem is also one of the artists featured in the exhibition. And we also wanted to bring into discussion 2 other curators working closely with commissioning and curating performance art today, Erin Lee and Rose Lejeune.
Yeah, and we wanted to give a huge thanks to Catherine Grant, who is moderator of the discussion tonight. Catherine is a reader in modern and contemporary art at the Courtauld. She is author of A Time of One's Own, Histories of Feminism in Contemporary Art, and co-author and co-editor of Fandom as Methodology, Creative Writing and Art History, and the Questionnaire on Decolonizing Art History 2020. She is a co-lead of 2 research networks, Group Work, Feminism in Contemporary Art, and Animating Archives. And with that, we'll turn it over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm really delighted to be chairing this panel discussion. And as Jess and Emma said, tonight's theme has been inspired by the MA Curating exhibition that's currently on show at the Courtauld. And I would also encourage you all to see it if you haven't done already. Entitled Good Morning Midnight, the exhibition explores the spaces, places and communities of the night. From Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings set in a Parisian cafe to photographs and paintings that utilise the sickly colours of the TV screen, the exhibition plays with a different context of nightlife, seduction, work and play. For example, in Susan Meiselis's photographs of strippers, the women wear their nudity like work clothes. The performance for others is a motif that recurs throughout the exhibition, and as I went round, it made me think about how we perform in different contexts. The bodies and encounters in the exhibition point to an interplay that is not a critique of voyeurism or desire, but instead looks to complicate these narratives. So today we're going to approach some of these issues that are raised by the work in the exhibition from a different perspective. And we're going to hear about curating performance in a variety of contexts, and perhaps think about the museum or gallery as a stage. The history of performance art within and beyond the gallery is obviously vast and varied, and we're not really going to be touching on sort of a lengthy history. But in recent decades, we've been seeing a lot more interest on the part of institutions who've traditionally not shown live art. And these interventions are sometimes contentious, sometimes kind of assimilated within the typical museum or gallery exhibition. We could think about when Cornelia Parker exhibited Tilda Swinton sleeping in a vitrine in the Serpentine in 1995. And some of you here will remember when that happened, that was deemed as quite a sort of a radical gesture, even though those of us who sort of engage in performance practices know that it really does sort of talk to a tradition that is already there in performance art. Or we could think of more recently when Sonia Boyce filled the Manchester Art Gallery with performances and interactions on an evening takeover in 2018, where a group interrogated the painting by John Waterhouse called Hylas and the Nymphs. And a group of drag artists were asked to perform and explore the issues around race, class, sexuality that were brought up by the work. And it included taking down the painting in the gallery and instead installing a kind of a set of conversations and performances that the painting sort of brought to life. So tonight we're going to hear from curators and artists to think about how curating performance art might work within different spaces and for different audiences. And the format is going to be that there are going to be 3 presentations. First, we're going to hear from Ned McConnell and Prem Sahib, and then we will hear from Rose Lejeune and then Erin Lee. And I'm very pleased to have them all with us today because they really do represent some really different and innovative ways of thinking about performance in the context of the museum and gallery, and also stretching out. So what I'm going to do is introduce our 4 speakers, then they will come up and each give short presentations. After that, we will all come to the front, and I've got some kind of fairly kind of big questions around curating performance that we will address. If at any point in the panel discussion people from the audience want to kind of ask a question, please do. We will open it up to the audience after we've had an initial discussion, but I'm aware that some of you in the audience may have kind of expertise and knowledge and experiences that you would like to share. So once we get into the panel bit, if you do want to ask a question, please do raise your hands. And we have somebody at the front here with a roving mic. So just to be aware that this evening is being recorded, if you want to ask a question, feel free to give your name, but also just be aware that you are being recorded. And it will go up on YouTube, on the Courtauld's YouTube after this evening. So I often think that's good to know before you ask a really hyper-contentious question and slur multiple of your colleagues or friends on when it's going to be recorded. Okay, so I'm going to do the introductions now. So Ned McConnell is a curator and writer. He's curator at the Roberts Institute of Art, where he commissions performances, develops exhibitions, and delivers the RIA residency alongside other public programmes in relation to the Roberts collection. He's a writer for Art Monthly and has written variously for other publications. He's written catalogue texts, including for Ryan Gander's exhibition, The Rates of Change, Flesh Arranges Itself Differently at the Hunterian, Glasgow, and Deep Horizons at Mima. Then Prem Sahib lives and works in London and works primarily in sculpture, but also in installation, performance, events, photography and sound. They graduated from the Slade in 2006 and from the Royal Academy Schools in 2013. Sahib's work has been described as a destabilised minimalism. I think that's a really interesting description for the work that they've got on show at the Courtauld. And often references the architecture of public and private spaces. Rose Lejeune is an independent curator based in London. In 2019, she founded Performance Exchange, a United Kingdom-wide programme that works with commercial galleries and has established a network of museums to present and acquire performance works. She's also curator for Delphina Foundation's Collecting as Practice, which engages with both historical museums and the future of collection development in a global context, and is co-curator of the Indrė Contemporary Art Biennial 2024, which I believe has just opened.
Just finished,
And currently, if that's not enough, she's finishing a PhD in curating at Goldsmiths, focusing on the institutionalisation and marketisation of performance art. And then Erin Lee is a curator at Delphina Foundation. Her recent curatorial practice centres around liveness, from street dance and live art, live culture in fermentation, to transforming everyday relations, processes and emotions into interdisciplinary art projects. She was previously a Symmetry Curatorial Fellow at the Whitechapel Gallery and a resident at Delphina. Erin has also worked as an Associate Curator at Taipei Contemporary in Hong Kong, Art Manager at Duddles, Hong Kong and London, and Project Researcher and Development Coordinator at Asia Art Archive. She is a member of AICA, and her articles have appeared in Art Forum and Art Review. So that's a brief introduction of our 4 speakers, and I'd now like to invite Prem and Ned, who are going to discuss Prem's recent performance work, Elias, which was curated by Ned. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks to all the students from the MA Curating course for inviting me. I guess I'll just start by talking a bit about RIA, which was founded in 2007. RIA is short for the Roberts Institute of Art. And it's based on a collection of contemporary works. The that spans everything from painting to installation to photography, video, and sculpture. And it has about 2,500 works in it and represents 850 artists. So the way that we work now is we don't have a space, so we're somewhat nomadic, and we work in collaboration with institutions and organisations across the UK to curate exhibitions from the collection, to present performance work, and to generally support artists. We also run a residency in Scotland, which is by invitation and is based on kind of offering time and space to artists to change or think through how they might progress their practice. We commission performance work, as I said, and that's been a large part of our focus since the inception of the organisation in 2007. We recently showed, obviously, Prem's work in Somerset House Studios, but previous to that, last year we showed an opera by Rachel Jones, which was shown in St James's Piccadilly, which is a church. Prior to that, we have shown work with GI Festival at a big nightclub warehouse space called SWG3, where we were presenting work by Paul Mahecki. That work was filmed, as well as being a live performance, and it's now currently being shown at Courtauld Gallery as a film, which is quite exciting for us actually, because that work was being made in a very challenging moment, I suppose. It was for the GI that was cancelled in 2020 or postponed to 2021. When we commissioned that work, we were unsure if it was going to be shown live or not. So basically, GI opened a week after the whole of Scotland came out of lockdown, and so people hadn't even really been into cafes or bars or outside of their house. And so we had put a contingency plan in to film the work before, so that we could have it online. And so we filmed it. We were also able to show it live, and then alongside that, and this is just to kind of demonstrate, I suppose, some of the ways that we've worked with performance and some of the ways perhaps that performance is being thought of these days, is that two of the artists were from abroad and couldn't travel to the UK to present their performances, and so we decided we would work with the architecture of the GI website to present kind of, I guess, performative interventions in the website, you might call them, where the two artists, Nina Bayer and Lina Lapaleti, created works with a programmer that would kind of pop up on the GI website and use the kind of unknown element of performance, or the contingent element of performance, or the surprise element of performance within the architecture of a website. Thinking about how we want to support the sustainability of performances, we also always try to tour performances or re-present them after we've shown them initially. One example of that is we showed a series of performances, 6 performances in London in a space called in the Wapping Studio Spaces in Wapping, which is a nightclub and a space where they shoot things like music videos and films, and we had a series of performances happening over the course of the night. 2 of those performances were then toured, one to the fruit market, which was Junior Apau Biochi Yodong, where his was a durational performance, and in the presentation in Wapping he showed a string trio that were improvising based on a video that they could see, a live feed of audience coming in and out of the space, but they were hidden behind a wall. So the audience couldn't see them, they could see the audience, and they improvised kind of a concert based on that, which went over the course of the evening. When that was then toured to the fruit market, the way Junior works is in kind of iterations. So the performers there were different, the instruments were different, so it was drums and piano and guitar, and they were responding to the video of the audience coming in and out of the space in Wapping. So it was kind of like the video of people coming in and out of the space acted as a sort of score for the musicians to respond to. And that was presented over the course of a longer period actually in fruit market, so it was more like a day, and audiences could kind of come in and out of their spaces. We subsequently then showed Harriet Middleton Baker, who was part of the Wapping presentation at Courtauld Gallery, where she had created a kind of I guess almost like a play that was based on the Davos kind of forum or Davos kind of meeting of minds. And the speaker, the keynote speaker, was giving a speech about how sleep and rest was the next kind of phase that capitalism should be taking hold of. And she gave this kind of very compelling speech, and then two dancers were dancing in front of her, kind of not a tango, but the idea was based on the kind of power relations that happen in a tango. And then there was a cellist, accompanied by a cellist as well. And that was presented in the Site Gallery, where they had built a purpose-built kind of scaffold auditorium for it to be shown in. So I guess that gives a little bit of an idea of the breadth of the kind of performances that we present. The commission that when we commissioned Prem, we were working in partnership with Somerset House Studios, where it was presented as part of their assembly program, which is happens every 2 years and is based on kind of experimental sound and noise and the way artists engage with that. It's had a few different kind of versions of it. One where an artist, Christian Marclay, kind of curated and performed and did the whole thing himself, and other times like the one that just happened where it's a number of different artists over a few days presenting a variety of different kind of perspectives on experimental music and sound. And one of the ways that we work is in collaboration, as I've said, and I think curatorial collaboration is really important to us. So we worked with the Somerset House team, the curators there, to select Prem, happily. Obviously, we know Prem well because he's in our collection, and we were really excited that we could work with him, and he had an idea for a performance straight away. I won't go into it because Prem's going to talk about that. But yes, so one of the things that we wanted to do then was also make sure it could tour somewhere, and so it will be touring to Edinburgh Art Festival in August. Book your tickets now. It'll be on the 16th, Friday the 16th of August. Just get that plug in. And that's being shown in a very, very, very different space. So it will be shown in a car park, and we found this kind of incredible spiral staircase that goes down into the car park, which is like overlooked by Edinburgh Castle. So it has all these kind of interesting dynamics going on in that space. And also, I think that space, the idea of a car park is it's kind of a no space, an in-between space. Lots of strange things happen in car parks, or they certainly feel that they do. They have like that race. So I think we're really, really excited to investigate what this work could be in a kind of public space like that. Yeah, so I think I'm going to play a little clip now of Elias to give you a bit of a sense of the work. This is very short because the work itself is about half an hour long. So this is just a few kind of sections from it. And then Prem is going to talk a little bit about the development of the work and how it came to fruition.
to the hurricane that was coming.
It's from the rehearsals of a longer 30-minute performance. And the work was really born out of a work I made in 2020, which used a recording I made in a gay online sex chat room. And it was a recording that was a kind of an encounter I had with someone in that space that was an example of hate speech in a way which was directed towards me. So despite being in that space, this person was being very homophobic and racist. And I worked with that sound recording quite sculpturally. I kind of ended up putting it into a mirror that I made, an obsidian mirror, and I was sort of interested in that material as being something that embodies ideas of kind of hate and trauma and heat and pressure, and how that kind of married with this sound recording. And it was really from thinking about this kind of instance of hate speech administered by an individual that I kind of landed on Suella Braverman. And I think, I was sort of interested in this sort of the difference between someone hiding behind a screen and then someone who's a public figure. And I began to look and think more about her speeches, and it was her speech on the illegal migration bill that was the foundation of audio work I made. And this was for the Gothenburg Biennial. So I, again, did what I did with the obsidian mirror piece, kind of paired this recording with an object, but this time it was something more structural, and it was the metal staircase that existed in the museum. So I used these small devices, sorry, I should have mentioned the same with the mirror. I've been using these devices called sound exciters, which are like small speakers that are kind of contact speakers that once they touch any surface or material, they kind of become, the object becomes a speaker. So they play through it, and they kind of reverb. So at the Gothenburg Biennial, a 15-minute recording of the illegal migration bill played, and it was sort of split in two parts. So one was the speech, and I had sort of edited some of that to include a recording that I made, which was a call and response. So I had got a group of friends together in a recording studio, and we did a kind of call and response version to some of the speech. And then the second part was a kind of complete sending back of those words, if you like. So I kind of again treated it quite sculpturally. I sort of slowed it down and reversed the recording. And this was played through the staircase, so when viewers went up and down the stairs, they could literally feel the kind of resonance of those words. And I liked how that object kind of embodied ideas around kind of hierarchical power shifts as well, and the audience having to move up and down. So I guess in some respects the foundations were quite performative. And then when the invitation came by to develop that piece, I worked with some new material that had surfaced in that time. So this was something from the Tory Party conference, and I structured the performance in 3 parts, 3 10-minute acts. And I've been thinking about people like Diamanda Gallis at the time, who's like a kind of American, some of you might know her, American like avant-garde performer and musician. And so some of her work, which spoke to issues around AIDS and genocide and the politics around the 90s became something I was looking and thinking about. And it was through her that I came across this poem by, it's a sort of surprising reference, but for me, but a poem by a Belgian artist called Henri Michaud. And it was, what I understand of it, described as a kind of hex poem. So it was a bit like a curse. And there are lines from that poem that I kind of used to help form a structure for the performance. So the 3 acts are named after lines in the poem. Act 1, Enter the House of Suffering. Act 2, I am rowing against your days. Yep. And Act 3, I split into countless rowers. And from what I understand of the poem, it wasn't really about kind of eliciting kind of like a destruction of like an object or a person, but it was more to try and reconfigure one's relationship to an antagonist. And so I was thinking about how do I transform these words, and the performance ended up being a kind of arrangement, a spiral arrangement of metal conference chairs with 3 performers, and I used sound exciters again to sort of rattle through the structure of this spiral, which I felt as a form really kind of encompassed all the viewers in the room as well, so they kind of became implicated in this sort of storm. And I used lighting to distinguish between the 3 different acts, but the kind of key feature, I guess, was that it moved from legible language into like kind of more what I would describe as sound action, and or what I'd hoped for it to have been. And so it was really about the transformation of those words. And at the beginning, I began by removing parts of her speech where she where she was speaking on behalf of the British people, and those are the words that the performers would replace with their own. And then there became this sort of process of transference, I guess, between the recorded backing track, that rhetoric, and the polyphony of voices that the performers were administering. And yeah, I kind of think it was about how I kind of thought about that rhetoric moving through a kind of social body and the kind of echoes of that more broadly. And the title itself is the kind of word Suella backwards, so it sounds a bit like the word alias, which I also quite liked. It became quite mercurial somehow in my thinking, or kind of questioning of different identity positions that might be kind of co-opted. And just wondering if there's any other parts about the script. The script, yeah, so I developed this score for the performers to use. This is the first instance of doing something like this. But it became very useful for me. I kind of began actually by kind of literally cutting up her words, almost like a kind of collage, and to sort of help kind of get into them and understand what I wanted to sort of draw attention to and not. And I think that really kind of brought my attention to how speeches are crafted. And so I used things like repetition and polyphony to sort of reinstate or to draw attention to certain things. And I saw the whole thing as a way of trying to refute that kind of language or find a relationship to it. That kind of was trying to send her words back, I guess, and that mirrored some of her proposed immigration policies of sending back the boats. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I'd now like to welcome Rose Lejeune to speak next.
Here's some more images. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Catherine, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I'm going to speak just briefly about 3 different projects that I've worked on, I guess probably really in the last 10 years or so. I've been an independent curator since about 2009, so have spent the vast majority of my professional life working kind of independently and in different institutions. And what I've tried to do, in particular in the last probably 7 or 8 years, is nevertheless think kind of long term. So try and work on projects that are going to be iterative and somehow kind of frameworks for thinking what these kind of different formats can be, in particular in relationship to the idea of not only performance, but I guess liveness and ephemerality in particular in relationship to collections. And so that has been a kind of ongoing way of thinking. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but Catherine mentioned I'm doing this PhD. I've been doing that for 8 years now as well, so it's a long-term thing. But in some ways, performance became a kind of prism for me to think about questions around the relationship between ideas of kind of public and private, commercial and critical, and again, the way that performance almost becomes a kind of prism to think about what the art infrastructure is and what sustainability and what kind of the current economic framework that artists work in is, and how this affects the kind of practices that are visible. So all of those kind of ideas, I think, somehow run through these projects in different ways. I'm not going to talk in detail about any of the specific projects, maybe slightly this one, precisely because they're all kind of frameworks rather than, like for me as a curator, they're kind of almost like umbrella ways of thinking. But if anybody wants to know anything about any of the specific projects, then of course we can. So I was going to talk briefly about this, which was one of a series of 4 different projects I did with different museums, probably from about 2015 to 2019. This is one of a series that were at the Victoria Museum in Liverpool, which is kind of an amazing museum actually, where it's got a lot of the kind of historic collections from the university that run right from the 1850s to kind of contemporary works, but it's only come together as a museum since 2008, since Liverpool was the capital of culture. And so they have this kind of hodgepodge of different things, right from like the dentistry collection, it's a particularly good one, through to like an art collection and a kind of, furniture collection. And this was part of what was the popular music collection. So each of these things was coming from different departments across the university. And so what I did was a series of projects working in the museum where we invited artists to come in and work with bits of the collection that had never been shown before, and to think in particular not just about how to show them, but how to kind of activate them. So for this one, we invited the Open Music Archive, who came and literally kind of brought the whole of this popular music collection from the kind of the slightly leaky basement up into the museum, just to kind of like literally show it. But also Open Music Archive is a duo, a collaborative duo whose interest is in music that is outside of copyright, so how music can be taken and in particular bits of it that are in copyright and bits of it that are not in copyright can be kind of pulled apart. So they set up a kind of digitization studio in the exhibition space where they're literally taking the physical records, digitizing them, and then pulling out the different bits between the kind of melody and the lyrics that can be used, and then inviting a whole series of different musicians, DJs, writers, to kind of activate that in the space and to really think about not just the idea of the collection as something that's a kind of static piece of archival history, but something that is still kind of usable and able to be reimagined. And for me, that was a really kind of nice part of a series of these projects, was to think how do these objects that sit in collections pertain to and think about liveness and think about being developed and processed, and how do artists kind of engage with that. And I was lucky enough at the same time to start working with the Delphina Foundation, who Erin also now works with, on this project Collecting as Practice, which didn't so much frame itself at all around performance, but on the other hand, nevertheless still thought about in particular the history of colonial collections and British colonial collections, and how artists from places that used to be part of the British Empire could come and kind of reimagine them. So for me, this idea of like process and reinterpretation and really thinking about the contemporary kind of significance and relevance and activation of those collections was really like running through a whole bunch of the work that I was doing. But at the same time, I had just moved into a new flat, which I had a spare bedroom, or we had a spare bedroom for the first time ever. And like I say, the PhD that I had just started was really at the time I think very much thinking about the art market and ideas of value. And so I decided, with my husband's blessing and happiness, he's sitting there going, no, I wasn't, to see whether I could kind of set up almost a kind of like sort of commercial gallery based in particular on this kind of history of commercial galleries in domestic spaces, and to invite artists whose practice was predominantly performance-based, or at least had performance as a very strong component in it, to use that space and to think about how to frame that. So again, I'm not going to talk in detail about all of the different projects. This is Grace Schwint, who did an exhibition in the space that was these vases, and then also a series of activations. And again, I'm very lucky that my husband is a very good cook. So we would do a lot of dinners and talks, and really kind of a lot of the aim for me was to say, how do you take a performance work? How do you think about the way that it relates to a material practice? And how do you invite collectors into that? And how do you invite different institutions that are interested in collecting these kinds of projects, and engage with that and think about that not only as something that you see as a kind of entertainment around the side of a market-based practice, but actually kind of integral to it. And when I started in 2016, I kind of gave myself a budget and said to myself, okay, I'm going to carry on doing this until I run out of money, and I'm going to see if I can sell anything, and I'm going to see if I can kind of top that budget up. But when I run out of money, I run out of money. And I quite quickly ran out of money. So it was a kind of like fate. I mean, it was a brilliant thing to do. I mean, it's exhausting doing stuff in your house like that, and it takes a lot of like negotiation, and you need to keep it really tidy. And but it was a really nice way of inviting people in and talking about performance and talking about the relationship of these material practices. But I quite quickly kind of, literally ran out of steam with it. And so at the same time, I started talking to one of the things that it did for me was to allow me to meet and talk to a lot of other commercial gallerists who were, I think, also going through and experiencing a lot of pressures kind of financially, but also like thinking, how do I support artists whose practice is maybe more experimental, more performance-based, more ephemeral? And in particular, like this idea of multidisciplinarity became really important, because what was happening, or what I was seeing with a lot of the conversations that I was having, was that an artist would work across a spectrum of different mediums. They might make painting, make installation, make drawing, make video, and make performance. And certain bits of that practice were very visible within the market, and certain bits of that practice were very visible within public museums. But there wasn't necessarily a place where that whole was kind of visible. And if what you did was sort of zoom out from that, if you saw their practice in one context, you would have a very different idea from how you saw it in another context. And so in conversation with 17 Arcade and Courtauld Gallery, who were the kind of three founding galleries, I started to develop this idea that would say, okay, what would a performance program that was based purely on artists who were represented by commercial galleries look like, and how would we kind of engage that? So that led to Performance Exchange, which we did. I feel like I did 3 editions of it, but I really only did 2, because it was supposed to be in July 2020. So I did all the work, and then it didn't happen. So we did it in 21 and we did it in 22. And each time it's basically a kind of umbrella of 13 performances across commercial galleries. And the invitation was, it has to be an artist that you already represent, and it has to be a performance, most of them in the gallery. Helen Cameron was not in the gallery. As you can see, she's in Arnold Circus, but it's very close to the gallery. And so you just had this whole, this Darren Bader at Sadie Coles, and we had a really nice mix, I think, actually, of very big established galleries, Sadie Coles, Pace, that kind of, like, in that sense, sort of level of gallery, and then much more sort of emerging smaller galleries. So over 3 days, we put together a kind of program, a day west, a day in the middle, and a day east, of these performances that you could kind of hop between all these different commercial galleries. So in some ways, using the format of a gallery weekend or a kind of condo-esque model, but really, really specifically thinking about them as kind of, like these live moments. And so it's just a couple of images. And what was crucial to me about doing this was that alongside the performance programme, I was creating for each of the works an acquisition document. So rather than just seeing that as something that you would go and see a kind of description of it, you would also get something that really kind of broke it down into its nuts and bolts of, okay, if this was going to a collection, how would it go into a collection? So that's partly about this idea of like the conditions of reproduction, the props, the kind of space that the performers need, the kind of economic framework that sits around all of that sort of stuff, as well as things like scripts, scores, photographic documentation, the archive, the way that an archive is built up. Does this exist as a unique work? Does this exist in an edition? How do future iterations of it need to relate back to the artist? What kind of equipment might you need? All of these kind of things so that you were really understanding that performance. Like I say, almost as something that like what would the package look like and what does it, and what that also entailed was a lot of really interesting conversations with artists about it's the death conversation, like the way in which like that performance is going can or might be able to live when they are no longer there, which for a lot of them, I mean, I think as an experiment was really interesting partly because it was the first time they had really thought about their performance work in that way, but also obviously enough partly because it then changes the work at certain points and invites them to think about that in different ways. So we had lots of kind of really, I mean, quite complex and often, you know, sort of involved conversations about when and if that was possible. But for me, it was, you know, the thing with something like performance exchange was also to really be able to talk about economics and really be able to talk about the way that performance happens and how it gets supported and how artists make money or don't make money, and to really think about whether or not and when the art market is also a suitable place for performance to happen, because I think its history has always been as very kind of anti-commercial, anti-institutional, you know, very much kind of set up in this kind of radical kind of like a positionality of not being interested in those things. And that wasn't the conversation I was having with a lot of the artists who were interested in it. A lot of the conversation was, I actually want to understand how and where the art market can be one of the tools that I use to sustain a practice. And so this, in that sense, obviously is not something that is suitable for everybody in every performance and every situation, but was a way for me of thinking, well, what would happen if you allowed it to be one of the tools that could potentially be used at certain points, and how does that, like in that sense, change what kinds of performances are visible, and how does that also offer ways into kind of a different art historical narrative for performances in and of themselves, rather than simply as kind of archival material. I'm going to leave it there. That's the end of mine.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Indrė.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jessica and Emma, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm really excited because, well, I know Rose and Ned from working at Delfina, but then I was lucky enough to be there to see Prime's performance. So really nice to be talking about it, like with you all. So yeah, my name is Erin, and I'll be kind of taking more like a chronological approach to my practice on curating performance art, and also kind of tell you a bit more about how it sits within my whole curating practice. So yeah, I've recently been thinking about, you know, my core concerns, I guess, as a curator, and a lot of these ideas are related to liveness, and whether it is like performance art, especially with a focus on street dance, that I'll also elaborate more on, but then also like foodways and fermentation, so like the live culture in the ferments, to also my interest in like the everyday, well, and also how, for instance, performance for me is not just something you see on stage, that's kind of permeated into our everyday realities. And yeah, so for me, like that's I guess how I see curating performance art. And then also in all my curating, I'm very concerned also about the audience performance, performance experience, but I guess also I guess how the audience, like once they enter a performance, they also become part of the performance itself, and then how they interact with the performers, and also what kind of energy is exchanged between the performers and the audience, and then also what kind of resonance and vibrations are in the room. So I'll walk through a couple projects that illustrate these ideas. So I guess, my personal interest in street dance really shaped a lot of the thinking in curating performance art. So I started practicing street dance myself about 3-4 years ago, kind of during, just kind of into pandemic. So it's really sad because I really enjoy, dancing and learning something with a full room of people, and then I had to kind of resort to TikTok classes, Zoom classes, which doesn't work well because they don't think about mirroring. So you're just kind of like, how do I, even follow? I don't know if they fixed that yet. But then also going into classes, always wearing a mask for 2 years. So I guess that really trained me up. But then also thinking about working with street dancers who have very interesting understanding of generally the space and then also audience, because it's such a format that inherently is interactive. So I will later also talk about some key concepts like ciphers and improvisation. That's very key in thinking about street dance. But this was my first attempt in engaging street dancers who are usually not familiar with contemporary art world. And then also later I moved on to not just simply engaging street dancers in contemporary art context, but also thinking more broadly on how the philosophy of street dance, like the subculture, could be useful or inspiring for organizing in contemporary art, because we often talk so much about kind of social structures or rebelling against capitalism or hierarchies in contemporary art. But then I realized sometimes in the way we work or in how our organizations are structured, there are so many hierarchies that I was really eager to kind of make some changes to. So I'll also elaborate on that. But yeah, this is the first performance. A 8-month live art exhibition at Daegung Contemporary in Hong Kong, where I was working, and the exhibition was co-curated by Remnants, Malasauskas, Curating, and also Louisa Ho with myself, and Tom Engel, sorry, Tom, if you're watching this YouTube. So the idea was to actually have a ever-evolving exhibition where we bring in different elements into the exhibition as it goes. So this idea of working with Max and Ocean was new for them because they never worked kind of with installation. So I also had to kind of step in as a producer and start drawing, about what kind of mirrors they want to make, and send it to contractors and talk about all these details about the different shades of the glasses. But it's quite amazing to see how they installed the mirrors in the space, but then also they performed and the audience really just kind of chimed in and started interacting with them. But then also when they're not there, we thought about having this element of performativity in the space itself, because the exhibition is almost also about having performance in a COVID time, echoing what Nat was saying, what you could do when you have very limited capacity to bring in international artists that we were engaging with, like Tino Segal. I think, for instance, that was maybe one time where he didn't use with a lot of the European performers that he usually engages with, but then instead decided to train up a lot of local performers.
So yeah, working on that exhibition, I really got to think a lot of also about the structures of care, but also of economics when curating performance art. Like when a lot of the performers came and to rehearse in the space, they asked us, where's the rehearsal space, or like where's our snack bar, or like drinks, and we were just starting to then think about these questions. So then, with a lot of this interest in mind, I came to London as a Symmetry Curatorial Fellow with Courtauld Gallery, and that was also a collaboration with Delphina Foundations. So as part of my fellowship, I worked on this exhibition, Out of the Margins, Performance in London's Institutions, 1990s to 2010s, which covered, including RIA, several other institutions in London that played a vital role since the 90s in supporting performance art. And it also went into a lot of discussions on, what kind of role our institutions and curators could play in a market where if they might otherwise not get so much support. So this also triggered me to start thinking a lot about, like, straight from curating performance art with artists that are still living to creating something that, in retrospective, thinking about what kind of documents and archives and conversations we could bring out from a more archival exhibition. So you can see there's kind of these very colorful boards about, like, the institutional histories and their involvement with performance art, but then also we actually went through many hours of performance video archives to think about, in this kind of context, in like a group exhibition, what kind of performances might be relevant today and also could still interact with the audience. So for instance, Carolee Schneeman's Meat Straw is like one of my picks. And then also, for instance, we managed to get Andrea Hamilton's prop from her performance in the Tanks in 2012. So when the Tanks was just opening up. So from her performance, Kabuki. So you can see really when you're in the space with the prop, you realize how oversized it is, and then you can kind of imagine what kind of embodied experience the performer was having back then. And that obviously there's also archival materials, but yeah, still a lot of these questions of then when I curate future exhibitions, what kind of documentations do I want to commission, and do I want to be kept in archives? Say 20 years later, maybe someone want to curate something, with my documents. And then also being in London and getting more involved in the local street dancing, like going to dance classes and realizing there are so many amazing street dancers here in London or in nearby cities. I was really inspired to curate this night of takeover at Whitechapel Gallery, and I think Catherine was also mentioning how sometimes performance is thought of as like usually associated to like a main exhibition program in big art institutions, and for me it was really important to give them the independent voice. So it wasn't framed as something that's inspired by the exhibition that was then at Whitechapel, but instead I gave all the performers their own framework to work with. So for me, something I was interested in is kind of how street dance symbolizes the fluidity of identities, whether it's related to race or gender or different kinds of personalities. So when I do, sometimes people are surprised when I tell them I do a hip hop dance or house dance. I just feel like I could kind of embody such different personalities within even one song. And that's the kind of feeling I wanted to also bring to the audience, but also kind of get inspirations from the high street of Whitechapel Gallery and the energy, but then also the energy from all the audience that come through. So the idea was also the brief to the performance was to make use of all the transitional, the
liminal spaces within Courtauld Gallery, which is a really beautiful assemblage of buildings, but then sometimes I feel when we go in, we just go straight into those galleries and we don't pay attention to like the foyer, the staircases, and there's also like a event space that's beautiful. So the idea is really to kind of open these up to different kind of audiences. So I'll give you a recap. Yeah, so something that really surprised me at the end is we didn't choreograph the end of the nights, which is also interesting for me because I think in talking about performance art, we talk about choreography all the time and scoring all the time, but then I think there's so much room left for improvisation that sometimes gives you more, and this is one of this occasion because all the performance was such experienced street dancers. They really know, you know, like when they can read the room and then they know when there's like no script, they just kind of go off and do their own thing. So they started inviting slowly, like one audience by one audience, and because people went through this whole 1 hour bombardment of street dance, they really felt like moving. So people actually like took their invitation and moved into the center of the room and all started like dancing and jamming together. And then I also summarized some of my thinking about how street dance could help our institutions welcome new communities, and then also in relation to kind of providing somatic experiences or more immersive, engaging experiences at museums where you're not just kind of walking from one object to another, but then you're also kind of thinking about how to engage the bodies of the audience themselves. Just kind of in the video I showed you, like the audience cannot stand still to watch the whole performance. They have to like constantly move to find the best angle and to also send their energy off to the performance. So yeah, we don't have time to go through this, but if you search this, you will be able to find it on our review. And then, so after this fellowship, I really loved London, loved how the audiences and the artists here really echo a lot of the things I was interested in. So I decided to stay here, and worked out quite well that Delphina hired me to be curator. As Rose just briefly mentioned, so Delphina Foundation is an independent art organization here in London, and it's the biggest art residency space here in the UK. And there are a lot, so every year we welcome 40 residents from all over the world with a focus on global south. A lot of times they come with their own practice and research, but also usually once in a year we have this one thematic season where the team also, alongside the residents, research something specific. So some of the recurring themes, like the one Rose mentioned, is collecting as practice. We also have performance as process, and the politics of food, or the upcoming one, Science Technology Society. So in last fall, we designated this season to be focusing around performance as process, which is to also see, as I said, see performance as something that's embedded in the everyday, like even when we, are talking here, we're kind of performing a persona. So the idea was to engage 8 residents from international residents, but then also 2 UK associates to discuss similar topics and then see what they come out with. But we also thought it would be super interesting if we invite artists working mainly in other mediums to see what comes out of this like ciphering. So this whole season we focused on the sub-theme ciphering vibrating. So cipher, as I mentioned, is a concept taken from street dance, and it's when a group of performers organically form a ring and take turns to kind of go into the center of the circle to perform, but then also always take inspirations from each other. And then for the audience in the on the side, you're not just watching, you're always kind of like snapping fingers, shouting and also giving off your energy. So I took that concept into the way we organize residencies. And so for instance, we even had one artist, Lena Bui, who has never done any performance before, but she was saying, I wanted to come and be inspired by performance artists and think about how a lot of my video works could be displayed in a more engaging way. And guess what? She ended up producing her first performance work here in London. You'll get a snippet of it. And it was inspired by her observations and musings when sitting on on Circle Line, thinking about what's circles means. So another highlight from the night.
So you can see in this night performances we took for Young Space, which is a music label, a music studio, and also this is another case of how the artists made use of non-traditional art spaces for performances. And very briefly on also, I think about public programming at Delvina, where it's really a good environment for more intimate workshops. So we've also done, for instance, this gastronomic grieving, a workshop where we think about mourning rituals in relation to food. So it's also about how to enable the audience to think about performance in their everyday life.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those presentations. There's so much in there, and also I love the connections between kind of music, scores, improvisation, and this idea of live cultures, both as kind of this sort of communities watching and participating, as well as this sort of idea of fermentation, which I know you didn't really manage to get a chance to talk about. I wondered whether, in terms of questions, whether we could start off with a very simple one, but in a way some of you touched upon this, and ask you what kinds of special support do performance artists need in comparison to artists working in other mediums, or how do you approach sort of curating performance practices in a way that might be different to other forms of curating? I know that Rose, you kind of literally come up with a kind of set of forms, which I love. I don't know whether you want to sort of say a little bit more about kind of what started you off thinking about how to set those up?
Yeah, I mean, I think
I guess in a general sense, I think that one of the things with curating performance, as opposed to other things, is that it's always about people and not, there are objects involved, but I think that idea of kind of care and that idea of how you look at, I think Erin pointed this thing of like, oh, there needs to be a green room and people need snacks, but also I think for me, one of the things that was really interested in about that, I became more and more interested in was the economics of that, which is to say that if you put a painting on a wall, the longer, this is quite reductive, but I'm going to say it like this anyway, the longer a painting is on a wall for, the better value for money it is to have put the nail in the wall and got your technician to, do it, whereas a performance every single day costs more money. So I think that's why very often it gets reduced to that kind of opening or the kind of entertainment, or it's, all of those kind of things. So I think for me, one of the things that it became a kind of prism to think about was the way in which the kind of financialization of the city, the way in which the changing kind of like paradigms around public funding, around, the cost of art education, the all of these kind of infrastructural things that meant that the way, this is partly about myself as well, right, as a freelance curator, but also the way that artists that I was working with were sort of struggling to kind of sustain types of practices that maybe a generation ago had been, let's say, easier. I don't know how they were. So I think, like, as a curator, I really started to think a lot more about how we talk about money, how we talk about care and looking after people, how money fits into that, but also, I guess, how, like, institutionally, it really requires that shift of thinking and understanding how, as a curator, you are there to, firstly kind of think about an artist, then think about a project, and then think about an audience, but that it's in that kind of process.
Thank you.
I feel like the economics thing is interesting, and obviously it's something we talk about a lot. We don't have a space, so we're often working with other people's spaces, other people's programs, some of other people's budgets. Obviously we bring a budget as well. One thing we try and do, like I said, was like represent performances, but I think there's like a sweet spot you have to try and find, because you're right, the analogy of the hammer and the nail thing is right, but also there's also like a lack of value sometimes if you just do it once, because there's so much work getting to that point, and then you do it once and then only a certain number of people see it and it's kind of gone. So it's a really, really tricky balance. And the other thing, like all the care things and looking after people, like museums have obviously over the years been set up to look after objects much more than people, so they're not really used to doing it. But I think even things like giving people access, right? If a freelancer's coming into a space, they need access so they can just freely move around the building or whatever, with passes and things. And I think there's stuff that goes right down to the level of how does someone work in this building if you're going to get them to perform a work, some labour or something in that building. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Erin?
Well, I think they covered a lot. But also, and maybe I'll just say a little bit also about then how, like, a curator have to sometimes play even more multi-layered role in this kind of projects, because sometimes you feel like you are like an HR person, you're like making rosters for like different performances, but when it's something involving like a lot of people, and then also, that kind of thinking about how to take care of the performance so they could take care of their body. I guess this particular thought came to me when I actually ventured into performing myself as another artist's work in Venice recently. And then I just thought, oh my God, the responsibility for a performing artist so big that you have to take care of your body and mind, I guess, for like the whole week before the performance, because if anything goes wrong, then like you can't perform, right? So like definitely like opening week with a lot of drinks in Venice is not a healthy setup for that. So then I just started to then think, having this perspective. Then for instance with the Whitechapel performance, the timing, we usually, I guess, we think about, oh, what's good for the audience to come and experience this performance, but then if the performance has to start at 7 and then goes on till 9, then what time do the performers eat? Like then I thought, oh, I also had the obligation to almost think about like either provide food or give them like a break in the afternoon. Like all of these details that are, I think, are quite important as well.
And I think it sort of shows in the kind of the final performances if people feel like they're sort of well looked after and that there's like a good sort of kind of energy between the curator and the performer, and that those are the worst experiences where it feels like somebody's been kind of drafted in and haven't really been synced to the space or the people there. And something that I really noticed in all of your presentations was this kind of attention to documentation, thinking about sort of performance during COVID, and also Prem, like you showed like the score as well as the kind of the filming of the rehearsal and the kind of the different, an iteration came up. And I just wondered whether for all of you, how you approached that notion of documentation, which has been kind of a sort of, I mean, such a sort of productive and difficult area in terms of performance art, and sort of both from the curatorial and the artistic point of view. Like, how have you sort of thought about the ways in which to kind of represent the work beyond the kind of the moment or the moments of it taking place?
I mean, from my perspective, it still feels very much live and constantly transforming. I mean, it began as an audio work. And as Ned mentioned, it's touring as well. So I think there's going to be various opportunities to keep sort of readdressing that as we go. Those videos rather were of the rehearsal rather than the actual performance. So I think I did see it very much about that kind of embodied experience of that particular iteration. However, as a work, it lends itself to constantly transform over time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing we've talked about with this work is that it's almost like it's site specific. Like originally the site was this sound work, then it moved to the kind of the obsidian mirror, then the staircase, and now these people's bodies, which will still be in or being played through, if you like, in Edinburgh, but the context of it, the space of the car park will also be almost another character, I suppose. So I think, you know, And I mean, I have to say, Prem's score is kind of like a piece in itself. I have to say, like, it's really amazing. And for someone that, you know, it doesn't like read or write music, for example, it's really a kind of an amazing piece, and the singers all knew exactly what they had to do and when, and it was really amazing. And Prem also produced a kind of graph for the lighting and sound engineers to know when to cue things. So I feel like the work is kind of exists in these component parts that can then be used to kind of piece it back together in a variety of different ways. I suppose in some ways similar to like a play or a dance piece, but just not with the same kind of language that's used in levitation or music or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you. And Erin, I wonder whether curating the exhibition at the Whitechapel had changed your sense of documentation, because obviously you were doing it on the other side of like curating a show of performance documentation. Like, has that given you a new perspective on how you might then approach it?
Yeah, for sure. Especially also, like when I was co-curating the Whitechapel exhibition, I just finished like this project I mentioned with Tino Segal, who many of you must know, you know, is famous for saying no to any kind of like image or video documentation. So then thinking about for like a Hong Kong audience who doesn't know his work very well, how do we even market this huge piece that we spent so much money on, right? Like it was kind of interesting how we in the end have to kind of use audience quotes from other places to promote it. Yeah, so then I also think about for instance, how can I in the future present these projects? So I guess in that sense, especially because this performance really moved across different parts of the building, I thought video was a good like medium to document. But then also how for the performers themselves, the artists themselves, like what kind of documentation they want, because it's important for their career, especially a lot of them have never performed in like a gallery or art museum setting before. So then you can see from the format, like the Instagram format. That's what like we prioritized when we had limited money. So yeah,
Were you live streaming it at the same time then, or what, did you edit it afterwards?
No, we totally edited afterwards because it was quite difficult to, well, yeah, I think to even find, a prime spot for always following the performance was difficult. But I do know people, the audience, they posted so many videos of this piece, and a lot of people kind of experienced like still maybe 1 month later, people come to me said, I missed it, but I saw it over Instagram.
Yeah.
So I guess, like audience almost play that role.
That's interesting. Rose, how about you?
I think what for me has always been really important is the clarity of what any piece of documentation or any kind of sort of ephemeral, however, or kind of ease, in the sense that, I mean, like, it's really interesting, this idea of people filming on their own cameras and then immediately putting that online, because I think it's very clear what the distance between the work that is experienced by the people in the room and then what I am seeing on Instagram is. But I think where it gets tricky, I mean, actually, this is something Ned and I, when the pandemic first kind of hit, and I was sort of about to do performance exchange, and we ended up doing a whole series of kind of online talks with different artists that the Roberts Institute was about to work with, and also that were going to be part of performance exchange. And I think that a lot of people at that time said to us, well, why don't you just do these commissions online? Why don't you just, and I resisted that completely, because I felt like that's a whole other thing. A performance to camera is a whole other thing. And I think for me what's really important is like, is this a work in and of itself? Is this a piece of documentation? Is this a translation of one thing? How does this relate to the live moment? Because part of what the live moment includes is other people watching it with you at the same time. It's atmosphere, it's all of these things that are included in the experience of seeing a performance. And so as soon as you translate that through, whether it's documentation or archival stuff, or you're changing the experience. It's no longer that thing. And there's all of those versions are possible and interesting, but being clear about what it is and what its status is and how an audience is going to relate that to that live moment, for me, is really important.
Yeah, I have to say I can't stand those kind of fixed camera, videos of like a stage with somebody doing something. It usually bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to what the experience was in the room. I think it's something we talk a lot about RIA, and the documentation that we have done. For example, for Rachel Jones' Hey Maudie, the opera, we did a kind of video that we tried to illuminate the process and some of the thinking, and so there was interviews with the co-librettist, the composer, Rachel herself, and the lead soprano, mixed with video from workshops where they were trying different things out with the singing and the music, and then bits from the actual performance. So it's not trying to be a documentation of the work, it's trying to offer some insight into the atmosphere that was trying to be created, the themes behind the work, all of those kind of things. I just think the kind of, because it's expensive, doing videos of performances is really expensive, and people often just think, well, I have to do something, so we'll just do that. But it's just it ends up being really ineffective and a really poor reflection on the work, and actually not very useful.
Yeah, unfortunately in the 90s, that's what a lot of them did, and that's what I was going through, falling asleep in front of the computer.
Well, I guess we've got access to a lot more flexible technology, and the fact you can have loads of people with their iPhones, and some of that footage will still give you a really good sense of what's happening. It's like, that has been an acceleration of the possibilities in documentation within a very short space of time. But I think all of your answers to that question sort of represent how much you all think about these different kind of moments of the performance. So a big question is like, how do you curate the audience's experience? And maybe we could think about that in the kind of the live moment, or like, how do you imagine it and kind of stage it? And if anyone wants to speak to that. I know that, Erin, that's obviously something you were very clear about in terms of the Courtauld Gallery, but even kind of, it'd just be good to hear a little bit more about, has that evolved across the different projects you showed us? Or
Yeah, so
I generally feel like in a lot of the exhibitions or performances, even exhibitions, I think a lot about like the bodies of the visitors, like that they've probably set like for the whole day, and then when they come to the exhibition, do we want them to like sit for a long time, and or do we want them to maybe like activate their kind of sense of engagement? So a plug-in for the current exhibition at Delfina. It's mainly a video and photo exhibition, but then for instance we ask people to pick up a torch, come in and explore the photo installation in like a very dim setting. And I'll talk a bit more maybe about the Young Space event. So you can't really tell from this video documentation that the performances were happening kind of in different corners of the building, and we made a schedule for people, and then some performances were happening like multiple times or throughout the evenings. I think Ned and Yates were there. So I feel like as a visitor you have this huge like responsibility, but also I guess sense of ownership that you get to choose where you go to see what, and then how long you want to spend with them. We try to make a schedule that allow people to essentially tick all the boxes, do everything if they plan smartly. But I just love how kind of this freedom to the audience, like to go to different parts of the building and engage with different performances in different ways, where like either the way you walk around, or sometimes in Amico Lee's piece there were kind of actors. They were just some of them just look like, well, do they? No, they were all dressed very dramatically. So you would identify them, but then they would have this like very intimate conversations with you. So I try to always offer these multiple ways to engage.
Rose, you've given people dinner.
Okay, people dinner, dinner and booze. I think, I mean, for me, what's really interesting, I mean, obviously with Performance Exchange, we did a similar thing, which was, like there's a schedule, and I think what we tried to do as well as that, I mean, it was to be really clear about, like, okay, this is something that starts at this time, and it's a this is a come in, sit down, watch it for half an hour, then leave at the end. This is a durational thing that you can drop into. This is so, and for me, one of the things in general I really like about working both kind of with commissions and also particularly with performance is that it's different for every work. So every time as a curator you're producing something, you're talking to an artist and you're saying, okay, like what is the way for the audience to experience this? Do we want them to just drift in and then be chatting, or do we want to say no? They've got to come in and be quiet. and is it theatre? Is it going to start on time? And if you don't get there on time, you're not coming in, or is it art? In which case they can just, like is it that kind of like what is the atmosphere? What is the vibe? What is the way that and that's individual to every work and how we think about that. So exactly that, the Grace Schwint piece that I showed that was in the flat, the opera singer was in the gallery on her own for about 45 minutes and would just, so people were coming in, arriving, having drinks, and then they would kind of, and she would just occasionally start singing, and then people would wander over there and go, oh, this, and then come back out. And then when everybody was sat down for dinner, she came back in and did like the performance. And so it was very deliberately kind of like in that sense, like it related to the social occasion in a very kind of specific way. Other things it was like, there's a performance, it's at 6 o'clock. You arrive, and I think, like that for me is what's really interesting, and what's really nice is that it's always a conversation about that. It's never like, oh, one size fits all for everything.
Thank you. Ned and Prem, do you want to?
I mean, I suppose like performances in general, like Erin and Rose have both said, it is very different for every performance and every different venue. But I think some of the things that we always try to think about is like comfort. How long are people going to be there? Do they need seats? Do we need cushions? Is there both seating and standing? Like sight lines. I mean, there's nothing worse than like being at a performance and like trying to get a view of somebody over there doing something strange. But I think with Prems, we talked a lot about priming audience members as they were coming in and as they were leaving. And, Yates and I, the other curator at RIA, we talk a lot about entrances and exits from contemporary art performances, because I think these are the kind of details that often get missed out, actually. You know, but they actually make a really big difference to what you take away from a performance. So I think, you know, depending on the performance, there's also lots of, I guess, tropes and things that you can draw on. Like, you know, Rachel's was in a church that frequently, you know, presents classical music, and we were showing an opera in there. Things were a little more straightforward than for that. People queued outside, they came in, took their seat. With Prems it was a little different, although there were protocols in place at Somerset House. But do you want to talk a bit about the priming thing of...
Yeah, so like, you know, I had 3 acts, but I also had an intro and an outro, and I think that was something that I sort of consciously used to think about how I kind of bring an audience into that piece, but also what I want them to sort of maybe take away and think about the kind of the framing of it, because I was quite conscious of like making something that was a bit like a kind of political commentary and then having it just be consumed in this kind of environment, and then everyone just sort of goes away and gets on with it. So I mean, I don't know how successful it was at like bleeding through, you know, kind of crossing those boundaries, but some of my thinking about like an outro that might kind of leave an uncomfortable kind of aftertaste, or kind of bring you back to reality in a way that hopefully goes beyond just the kind of spectator consumption of that work, with things that we spoke about quite a bit.
I also think in your work there was a sometimes very uncomfortable play with humour. You know, like we saw the clip where they were doing very high-pitched voices of a particularly kind of awful moment in the speech, and then the outro that you took from this video that went viral.
Yeah, it was Priti Patel and Nigel Farage dancing to a Frankie Valli track at the Tory Party conference after party, and I did try and find out what the DJ set was, but unsuccessfully. But there was this one clip that went viral of them dancing to that, and it just kind of felt so insidious and wrong. So I kind of, you know, things like that came into the work in a more kind of codified way.
And I'm aware that we're running over time, and I've taken chair's privilege from you, the audience, but I'd like to open up and see if anyone has any questions. And I know we are at time, so if people do need to leave, you're very welcome to do that whilst we address any questions people might have. Oh, Diego has one, and then I think one in the front.
So my ears kind of perked up when we discuss performance art to camera and its relation with digital art. And so I was kind of thinking about extending the discussion to fit within the larger theme of curating as opposed to documentation, and kind of garner your thoughts on what are some of the possibilities for performance art that is made for and consumed for on the internet, and how do we kind of treat these works in a physical space, I think beyond just the duration of image or some type of video.
So do you mean if it's a work online, how we experience it on our computer?
Or on the phone.
Or on the phone, but not in a gallery necessarily.
Well,
maybe.
How do we transition from experiencing work that is made for the internet into physical space?
I mean, I suppose the example I would give from what we've done was the GI Glasgow International presentation that we made in 2021, where we worked with Lena Lapaleti and Nina Bayer to create performance-based works that were going to be presented online. And we were very conscious that we didn't just want a page on their website with a video that people could choose to go and play and stop and pause and rewind. And the artists were also very clear that they did not want that, and they wouldn't do that. So we worked with a programmer to create a kind of additional architecture to the website, whereby when you arrive at certain times of the day, when you arrived on the gallery, the GI website, when you first clicked anything on the homepage, these pop-ups would appear and would play. So Nina Byers was small videos of these giant dogs chasing remote control cars with hair coming out of the back of them. In one of the spaces it's actually in the space that Paul did his performance. And then Lena's was based on a work that she had presented at the Baltic Triennial, and it was, so there was singing involved, and there was videos of these logs that were kind of brushing up against each other. So the physical work that was presented in Riga was this huge kind of dock that was filled with logs that would, and then there was a performer who would sing, and so that was kind of adapted in the same way to work with the architecture of the GI website. And the reason we wanted to do that was, I guess, because it was a way to interrupt people's usual way of watching things online, and also to kind of enact this element of surprise, I suppose, or an encounter that you get with performance work. I think when you go into an exhibition, often, obviously every exhibition is different, but when you go in, there's expectations you have that you're going to see objects, and there's a fairly kind of standardized thing that you go into. When you go into a performance, it's very difficult for marketing and things to tell you really what you're going to experience, because it plays out in three-dimensional space and time and unveils in that way. So I guess we were trying to disrupt that. I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess it's an example of working in that way.
Thank you. Was there a question at the front? Or yeah, you don't mind waiting for the mic? Thank you.
I'm kind of interested in the sort of spontaneity that you were talking about, Erin, in particular, and sort of looking at those images of people joining in. I don't know if I would have expected that necessarily for a Whitechapel. I mean, maybe, but if you were to represent that again in a different context, how would you sort of navigate around, people not joining in, people joining in? I mean, I guess I'm sitting also next to an artist that did a performance recently which involved an element of kind of spontaneity or reacting to audience reactions, and it's just sort of endlessly interesting how that, how that can play out in an intimate space and how you account for it, how you build it in. Similarly, Prem's performance is going to be represented in with a completely different audience setup. So, I mean, anyone to take that question around spontaneity, really.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because as I said, we didn't plan the ending of it, so it was a happy surprise that it ended up this way. But in response to what you said, it's interesting because I was embedded in the Whitechapel team for 6 months, and I realized the Thursday nights that they kind of regularly do, the demographics of the audience is very different from the exhibition demographics, which sometimes involves like an entrance fee, so which could contribute to that. But then I would argue it's also the different kind of artists they bring in and the kind of engagement they offer on Thursday nights. And this event also took over on a Thursday, so I feel like that kind of community really came out, who we know are a little bit maybe more prone to interacting with the performers, and also maybe from kind of reading about the performance, it kind of talks about the fluidity of identities and the interaction. Maybe we managed to attract these people because they probably expect to also be kind of standing very close to the performers, and you might have seen doing Anastas. He is just so amazing. He just literally walked right into the a crowd of audience, and people just made a route for him. So I guess it is definitely when I curate, I definitely think a lot about what kind of audience we would probably draw, and then what kind of interactions we might be able to get out of them. Because there was another performance, Shanice, I think the same evening as Prem's performance, and what Shanice was trying to do is to actually really engage all the audience with kind of using their body to make beats. And I overheard in the audience that some people said, oh, maybe we're, like, too British here, like it would have worked much better if this performance takes place somewhere else. And I felt like, ouch, like, so I think probably for a curator and for an artist, it's good to also kind of maybe think a little bit about what kind of audience you're usually drawing. And for that night, I guess maybe like it was a ticketed event. So sometimes these could be barriers to certain communities. Yeah.
I wonder whether this is maybe a time for a change of our pace and situation, because unless people have burning questions, there are drinks in the research forum just along the corridor, and so we could continue this in a more informal setup. But if anyone does have a burning question they would like to ask, please let me know.
On camera.
Yes, please do.
Very quick question. I'm just interested to hear about your perspective on reenactment of performances. From your performance at Somerset House included almost a script, and what would be your perspective on completely different performers re-performing the performances many years later, or for example, Erin, when you were curating your exhibition at the Courtauld Gallery, and some of the performances were in the 90s, did you contemplate having reenactments in the way that, for example, we saw the Marina Abramovich show?
Erin,
I felt like the score is something that came about both through necessity, but was also a really important part of the process that I think would allow it to be re-performed. We're working with the same performers for Edinburgh this time, but a lot of the performances have emerged out of workshops initially. So I think the score hopefully communicates that and ways in which it can be re-performed in the future.
In my case, it was like a reenactment for that exhibition because we don't have budget. We just don't it's practically impossible. But also because I think we are aware that to make a reenactment successful, there are so many factors you have to take into account. Also, kind of the context of like times have changed, and also you might be performing to a completely different kind of audience in a different country, and all of that, just how to make it still make sense and be considerate to everyone involved is a huge, and also sometimes in certain performances it was like the artists themselves, but then in some reenactments they have to ask someone else to do that, but then it might be really physically laborious, or it could. Yeah, like a lot of these things, when you ask someone else to do it, there's also moral questions, right? So, in that case, it was impossible.
I think it is worth saying, though, that I'm old enough to remember the Whitechapel doing a short history of performance, which is probably 20 years ago now. But it probably is 15, 20 years ago that they did that. The Whitechapel did, I think, 4 or 5 exhibitions, probably around the early noughties, called A Short History of Performance, where they precisely did that. They did all of the greatest hits, and it was a really, I think, interesting experiment, precisely because of all the problems that you're pointing to. And there were some really kind of famous things, like the Joan Jonas performance, where this is a performance from the 60s where I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, she's moving these mirrors around, right? They're these huge, big, heavy mirrors, and she's naked and moving these things around. And she had only ever been the person she had always performed in her own work. And then when they were in the process of talking to her about that, she said, actually, I think it's truer to the original at this point to have somebody else do this work than for me to try and do it as an old lady I think she was probably in her 70s even then. She's very ugly now, I think. So, I think that does raise questions about, obviously, the context. And the Abramovich is really fascinating from the point of view that, those early works are in 1970s Belgrade, so the context that they are being produced in is really, really important and really, really different, and there's no way that you can experience them now with the knowledge that she is going to become a global superstar, she's going to become Lady Gaga's best friend. And so, which not criticism, but it's like, you know, like there's something about seeing them now and knowing retrospectively like what's going to happen to her in that work that nobody in 1970s Belgrade watching her in the middle of a star passing out is like has so but I think that actually for me in some ways those questions and those kind of conundrums become really like really interesting and really kind of important to grapple with from a kind of like art historical like point of view, for want of a better way of putting it.
I feel like as well, like these things will get maybe not easier, but maybe more formalised because of the work of like UOs and the work being done at places like Tate and the time-based media conservation department there, that they've actually just released a new website which is called Precarious Movement, which has lots and lots of information about the kinds of things that need to be considered when acquiring a performance into a museum and the upkeep of it and how, you know, all of those things, which is an amazing resource. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I'd definitely urge you to head over that way.
Maybe that's a good place to leave everything. I'd like to really thank all of our panellists and